Democracy and participation in the USA refer to the way citizens engage in politics through elections, representation, and pressure groups to influence government decision-making and policy outcomes. The electoral system in the USA is a federal, indirect system based on single-member districts and the Electoral College where voters do not directly choose the president. The main process to elect a U.S. president is a long cycle involving party primaries and caucuses, national party conventions, a nationwide general election, and a final decision by the Electoral College. The constitutional requirements when electing a U.S. president are that the candidate must be at least 35 years old, be a natural-born citizen, and have lived in the USA for at least 14 years. The invisible primary is the informal stage before voting begins where candidates seek media attention, elite endorsements, and fundraising support, and affects the election as it narrows the field before primaries start. This is shown when Joe Biden secured strong party endorsements and fundraising support in 2019, which helped establish him as the Democratic frontrunner before voting began. Primaries and caucuses are state-level elections where party members choose delegates to support a candidate and affect the election as they determine the eventual party nominee. This is shown when Donald Trump won a majority of Republican primaries in 2016, allowing him to secure the nomination despite early party opposition. The role of national party conventions when electing a president is to formally nominate the party's candidate, unite the party, and launch the general election campaign. This is shown when the Democratic National Convention in 2020 officially nominated Joe Biden and helped consolidate party support ahead of the general election. The role of the Electoral College is when electing a president is to translate state-level election results into electoral votes that formally decide the presidency. This is shown when Joe Biden won the presidency in 2020 after securing 306 electoral votes despite close margins in several key swing states. The resulting party system after the election is a two-party system dominated by the Democrats and Republicans. This is shown when the 2024 presidential election again featured only Democratic and Republican candidates as realistic contenders for the presidency. Incumbency is the advantage held by a sitting president who is already in office during an election. Incumbency is important for a president seeking a second term as it provides greater media exposure, name recognition, and the ability to use the powers of office. This is shown when Donald Trump used presidential press coverage and executive authority extensively during the 2020 election campaign. However, incumbency may not be important for a president seeking a second term as poor economic performance or major crises can outweigh its advantages. This is shown when Donald Trump lost the 2020 election following public dissatisfaction with his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The role of campaign finance in an election is to fund advertising, staffing, travel, and voter mobilization efforts that increase a candidate's visibility and competitiveness. This is shown when Joe Biden and Donald Trump both raised hundreds of millions of dollars in the 2020 election, allowing them to dominate media coverage. The current legislation on campaign finance is a mix of federal limits on direct donations and regulations overseen by the Federal Election Commission. The McCain-Feingold reforms from 2002 mean that soft money donations to national parties are banned and limits are placed on broadcast election advertising. The case of Citizens United vs. FEC 2010 mean that corporations and unions can spend unlimited amounts on independent political advertising, increasing the influence of super PACs. The key ideas and principles of the Democratic and Republican parties can be understood by examining how power is distributed between them, their contrasting ideological positions, internal divisions, and the social factors that shape voter support. The distribution of power among the Democrats and Republicans is relatively balanced at a national level, with control frequently shifting between the two parties across the presidency, Congress, and state governments. In relation to the U.S. Democrat Party, a progressive attitude on social and moral issues, including crime, is shown through policies such as criminal justice reform, as seen when Democratic-led states like New York raised the age of criminal responsibility and supported bail reform between 2019 and 2023. In relation to the U.S. Democrat Party, greater governmental intervention in the national economy is demonstrated by large-scale federal spending, as shown when the Biden administration passed the American Rescue Plan in 2021 to stimulate economic recovery after COVID-19. In relation to the U.S. Democrat Party, government provision of social welfare is a core belief, as shown when Democrats expanded access to health care subsidies under the Affordable Care Act through legislation passed in 2021. In relation to the U.S. Republican Party, a conservative attitude on social and moral issues is evident, as shown when Republican-led states such as Texas passed restrictive abortion laws following the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Jackson in 2022. In relation to the U.S. Republican Party, more restricted governmental intervention in the national economy while protecting American trade and jobs is shown when Republican leaders supported tariffs and trade protection measures originally introduced under Donald Trump and defended them during the 2024 campaign. In relation to the U.S. Republican Party, acceptance of social welfare but a preference for personal responsibility is shown when Republicans backed work requirements for welfare benefits, as proposed by House Republicans in budget plans between 2023 and 2024. The U.S. Democrats have three factions: liberals, moderates and conservatives. The U.S. Democrats liberals are members of the party who support progressive policies such as expanded social welfare, strong civil rights protections, and greater government involvement in the economy. The U.S. Democrats moderates are members of the party who favor centrist policies, pragmatic compromise, and incremental reform rather than radical change. The U.S. Democrats conservatives are members of the party who hold more traditional or cautious views on economic policy and government spending while remaining socially liberal. The U.S. Republicans also have three factions: moderates, social conservatives, and fiscal conservatives. The U.S. Republican moderates are members of the party who support limited government and free markets while being more flexible on social issues. The U.S. Republican social conservatives are members of the party who prioritize traditional moral values, religious influence in politics, and opposition to abortion and same-sex marriage. The U.S. Republican fiscal conservatives are members of the party who focus on reducing government spending, cutting taxes, and limiting state intervention in the economy. The current conflicts and tendencies within the Democratic Party involve growing influence from liberals challenging moderates over issues such as healthcare and climate policy, leading to internal tensions over the party's future direction. The current conflicts and tendencies within the Republican Party involve increasing dominance of social conservatives and populist figures, which has reduced the influence of moderates and intensified ideological divisions within the party. In relation to race, voting patterns were influenced in the 2020 presidential election campaign as ethnic minority voters overwhelmingly supported Joe Biden due to Democratic positions on civil rights and social justice. In relation to religion, voting patterns in the 2020 presidential election campaign were influenced as white evangelical Christians strongly supported Donald Trump due to his conservative stance on abortion and religious freedom. In relation to gender, voting patterns in the 2020 presidential election campaign were influenced by a significant gender gap where women were more likely to vote for Joe Biden due to concerns over healthcare and social issues. In relation to education, voting patterns in the 2020 presidential election campaign were influenced as university-educated voters tended to support Joe Biden while non-university-educated voters were more likely to support Donald Trump due to differing economic and cultural priorities. An interest group is an organized body that seeks to influence public policy and government decisions without standing candidates for election. Interest groups are significant in the USA as they provide representation for specific interests and attempt to shape legislation and public opinion. This is shown when gun control groups such as Everytown for Gun Safety increased lobbying and campaigning following major mass shootings between 2021 and 2023. However, interest groups may not be significant in the USA as elected officials and courts may ignore their demands or act independently. This is shown when Congress failed to pass comprehensive gun control legislation despite sustained pressure from multiple interest groups after the 2022 Uvalde shooting. The resources that interest groups in the USA have are money, expertise, membership numbers, access to policymakers, and media influence. The tactics that interest groups in the USA use are lobbying, litigation, campaign donations, grassroots mobilization, and public awareness campaigns. Interest groups do have an impact on democracy in the USA as they increase participation and ensure diverse views are represented in the political process. This is shown when civil rights groups supported voter registration drives during the 2020 and 2024 election cycles to increase turnout among underrepresented groups. However, interest groups may not have an impact on democracy in the USA as wealthy groups can dominate decision-making and marginalize ordinary voters. This is shown when corporate-backed super PACs spent heavily during the 2020 presidential election, raising concerns about unequal political influence. A professional interest group is an organization that represents the interests of people working in a specific profession. An example of a professional interest groups in the USA is the American Medical Association. The influence of the American Medical Association is seen through its ability to shape healthcare debates by advising lawmakers on medical policy. The methods of the American Medical Association include lobbying Congress, publishing expert research, and engaging with government agencies. The power of the American Medical Association comes from its professional expertise, credibility, and access to policymakers. A policy interest group is an organization that seeks to promote a particular cause or set of values rather than the interests of its members. An example of a policy interest groups in the USA is the American Civil Liberties Union. The influence of the American Civil Liberties Union is shown through its role in shaping civil rights policy and public debate. The methods of the American Civil Liberties Union include strategic litigation, lobbying, and public education campaigns. The power of the American Civil Liberties Union comes from its legal expertise, high-profile court cases, and strong public support. The interpretations and debates of U.S. democracy and participation focus on the strengths and weaknesses of elections, the Electoral College, campaign finance, incumbency, and the influence of interest groups on political engagement and representation. The advantages of the U.S. electoral process are that it encourages high political participation, regular elections, and clear choices between candidates and parties. This is shown when voter turnout increased significantly in the 2020 presidential election, reflecting strong public engagement despite the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the disadvantages of the U.S. electoral process are that it can discourage participation through voter suppression, complex registration rules, and unequal representation. This is shown when several states introduced stricter voter ID laws after 2020, which critics argued reduced access for minority and low-income voters. The advantages of the Electoral College are that it protects the interests of smaller states and reinforces the federal nature of the political system. This is shown when smaller swing states such as Arizona and Georgia received significant campaign attention during the 2020 election. However, the disadvantages of the Electoral College are that it can distort the popular will and allow a candidate to focus only on a few key states. This is shown when millions of votes in safe states such as California and Alabama had little impact on the final outcome in 2020. The electoral system and Electoral College should be reformed as they can produce unrepresentative outcomes and undermine public confidence in democracy. An example that backs this is widespread public debate and protest following the 2020 election over whether the Electoral College fairly reflected the popular vote. However, it should not be reformed as it provides stability and prevents densely populated areas from dominating national politics. An example that backs this is the peaceful transfer of power following the Electoral College certification of Joe Biden's victory in January 2021. The role of campaign finance is effective as it allows candidates to communicate their policies widely and mobilize voters. An example that backs this is the extensive use of digital advertising funded by large donations during the 2020 presidential campaign. However, the role of campaign finance is not effective as it gives wealthy donors and groups disproportionate influence over elections. An example that backs this is the dominance of super PAC spending during the 2020 election, which overshadowed smaller grassroots campaigns. Campaign finance has been effectively reformed as transparency requirements mean that many donations must be publicly disclosed. An example that backs this is the routine reporting of campaign donations to the Federal Election Commission during the 2024 election cycle. However, campaign finance may not have been effectively reformed as loopholes still allow unlimited independent spending. An example that backs this is the continued growth of super PAC expenditure in federal elections since 2020. Incumbency has an important role in elections as sitting officeholders benefit from name recognition, media coverage, and access to resources. An example that backs this is President Biden's ability to use presidential visibility and achievements during the 2024 campaign. However, incumbency may not have an important role in elections as public dissatisfaction can outweigh its advantages. An example that backs this is Donald Trump's defeat in the 2020 election despite holding the presidency. Interest groups can influence the three branches of government as they lobby legislators, challenge laws through the courts, and advise the executive. An example that backs this is the American Civil Liberties Union bringing legal challenges to state voting laws between 2021 and 2023. However, they cannot influence the branches of government as officials may prioritize public opinion, party loyalty, or constitutional limits. An example that backs this is the Supreme Court allowing restrictive abortion laws to stand in several states despite sustained interest group opposition since 2022. Interest groups can influence policy creation as they provide expertise, draft proposals, and apply pressure during the legislative process. An example that backs this is environmental groups influencing elements of climate policy within the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. However, interest groups may not be able to influence policy creation as strong partisan divisions can block reform. An example that backs this is the repeated failure of Congress to pass comprehensive gun control legislation despite intense lobbying since 2020. Thank you for watching this video on US democracy and participation. I'll see you in the next one.